Hi, Bruce and John.
So glad you're pushing forward with the Incident Response Forum. I'm Phyllis, Sumner, Partner and Chief Privacy Officer with King & Spalding. My one big thing is board security. With the increased risks that COVID-19 brings to organizations, board activity has increased more than 100%, and boards are communicating in remote locations across the globe. It is more important than ever to keep those board communications safe and secure. And don't forget, turn off those household devices that control your lights and adjust your music, and keep those confidential communications secure. Thank you.
Welcome back, everyone. That was the first of our One Big Thing videos from some of our panelists. Those will be scattered throughout the day. Well, next up is the Counseling Boards panel, which is a great morning panel because I think boards are meeting right now, and lawyers like this panel's moderator, Phyllis Sumner, are right now helping them manage this crisis. So let me introduce to you who you're going to be hearing from, and then let's get right into this presentation. Hopefully you all enjoyed the first one, and that'll be of 11 sessions today. So this is session number 2. Okay, as I said before, the moderator is Phyllis Sumner, who is really the Michael Jordan of data security. Not only because Phyllis has worked on the response of some of the more significant data security incidents in history, and that includes Equifax, Home Depot, Capital One, just to name a few. But in addition to being a partner at King & Spalding, Phyllis is also their Chief Privacy Officer. In fact, I believe of the 42 speakers we have today, she's the only one who shares both of those titles. I'm very interested to hear what Phyllis is telling boards right now. We got a preview of that on her One Big Thing video. By the way, I showed all of the One Big Thing videos, which are available on the Docket Media YouTube channel, to my 15-year-old son. And he said, Phyllis, that yours, he said to me, Dad, you know, yours was good, but that Phyllis lady's was the best of everyone's, and she's probably a huge success. And I think he was right on both counts. Welcome back, Phyllis, for your 5th year in a row at the IR Forum. I hope all is safe and healthy for you in Florida. So welcome.
Thanks, John. Great to be here, and appreciate your son's great taste.
Excellent. Next up is Luke Dembrosky. My friend Luke Dembrosky, he's a partner at Debevoise in Plimpton, and he has the kind of government experience that is really like no one else that I know. First, he was DOJ's resident legal advisor at the U.S. Embassy in Moscow, something only maybe a half dozen or so DOJ attorneys has ever done. I think he lived there for 3 years or so with his family. Second, he was the deputy chief for litigation at DOJ's CSIPs. You're going to be hearing CSIPs a lot today. That's the Computer Crime and Intellectual Property section, sort of the cyber section of the Department of Justice. And he spearheaded the government's response to Target, Sony, Home Depot, Anthem, OPM, and a lot of other data breaches. And third, as Deputy Assistant Attorney General at the Department of Justice's National Security Division, which is different than CSIPs, he focused on nation-state threats. It's not surprising that New York Governor Andrew Cuomo has selected Luke to serve as a member of the governor's Cybersecurity Advisory Board. My guess is that we'll be hearing a lot more about Luke in the future. Welcome, Luke.
Thank you, John.
Excellent. Next up, we've got, so this is a panelist I'm very excited about because we've never really had anyone from a company before. We normally get the outside lawyers, and she's also never spoken at the IR Forum before. And I'm thrilled that she was able to do this. Jocelyn Hunter has worked in the Home Depot legal department since 1997. And she's in a position where she manages data security incidents. And that's sort of a trend in a lot of these bigger companies in their GC's office, to have a specific person who's got this responsibility, this quarterbacking responsibility for IR. And I'm interested in her role to see how she sees it. How does she balance with the CIO, the CISO, the rest of the C-suite, and really take charge? Jocelyn was also, I believe, at Home Depot when Phyllis was working on it, and while Luke was supervising the DOJ CSIPs team investigating it. So Jocelyn, if you have any gripes about DOJ's treatment of Home Depot, it seems like the perfect time is right now. I hope you're okay in Atlanta, and welcome here. Welcome.
Thank you. Thank you so much. Happy to be here.
Excellent. And then finally, we have another 5-year veteran, Jason Smolanoff, who's global head of cyber at Kroll. When it comes to cyber, Jason is the real deal. As Kroll's head of cyber, he's really grown Kroll into an international cyber and IR dynamo. He was at Kroll, the head of cyber under Dave Fontaine there at the time, where the two of them really grew it incredibly. And now, Jason, after it got acquired by Duff & Phelps, it's grown to even more lengths. And then Duff & Phelps was acquired by another company, and it keeps growing. And what's interesting is that he does security science, digital forensics, and they also will do the PFI work in the remediation. I think is really one of the only, if not the only, big firm to do that, or maybe a few others. And Jason, like his firm, he can really operate in any of those areas, whatever it is, remediation or preparation or the PFI work. His biography could really be published in volumes, like a lot of these people. It's very difficult to write these intros because there's so much to say. He was a former FBI agent who supervised the FBI's Cyber National Security Squad. He also was an agent in Afghanistan going undercover for the FBI's major organized task force. He was a former supervisor in the FBI's electronic task force. And then to top it all off, he's a physical chemist who designed computer chips for IBM, Intel, Motorola, and others. Probably the only panelist today who actually earned 2 patents. Jason, it's great to see you, my brother. I hope all is safe and healthy with you in LA.
Thanks so much, John. Really, really appreciate the kind words. Thank you.
Excellent. Well, Phyllis, I'm going to turn it over to you. Then I'm going to move over to get our next panel ready. Can't wait to hear you get started. So take it away, Phyllis.
Thanks, John. Thrilled to be here, and especially with this esteemed group of folks. We're going to kick this off very quickly because we have a lot to cover in this session, and we're really focused on the increased scrutiny that boards and the C-suite are under after a significant security incident, and talk about ways that boards can become even more prepared to address those issues. So, Jocelyn and Luke, I want to start with you all and maybe set the stage with some thoughts around what we're seeing in the headlines after a security incident, and in particular, the focus on boards and C-suites. Jocelyn, you want to start?
Yeah, I will. I'll just say that, I think a data breach and really any sort of large incident crystallizes the focus on the efforts of the board of directors, which is really there to represent the shareholders. And in doing so, they really have a role of overseeing the company and overseeing various risks. And I think a large data incident just sort of crystallizes the public perception and the public focus on how the boards are actually doing that oversight work with respect to data incidents.
Luke, what thoughts do you have on that?
Thanks, Phyllis. So I completely agree with Jocelyn's point. And in terms of the media, the pressure is now very front-loaded. It's a combination of regulatory disclosure requirements being pushed forward, media pressure being intense, so that now you don't have as much time to think about it. So that puts a bigger premium on the board and management planning for incidents, having a good program in effect in advance. For some time now, we've seen a lot of regulatory focus on board and C-suite accountability for cyber issues. In the past, these were IT and InfoSec focused concerns. Now, in our interconnected age, they're viewed as whole of company risks. They're also whole of company opportunities, as many of our clients are focused on AI and related issues. It's just more surface area and intense focus on boards to get their arms around what for many of them, is a new area.
Yeah, and that's a great segue to the next question, which is really focused around the change in risk, which obviously impacts the board's oversight responsibility. Jason, let me turn to you and ask you to address what we're seeing in terms of the shift in risk, and in particular, increased risk as a result of COVID-19.
Sure. Thanks, Phyllis. I think over the last few years, one of the major shifts that I've seen is the way that networks are designed and the way that business is being delivered by IT operations. So several years ago, most companies had on-premises networks or networks that were interconnected. What we've seen over the last 5 years are on-prem and sort of hybrid networks, which are utilizing on-prem solutions and cloud solutions as well. And as companies have been moving into a cloud-based or hybrid environment, not only has the way that they've been delivering their business changed, but also the security considerations have changed as well. And I think that these days, with the strong push as a result of COVID-19 towards a work from home scenario, lots of companies have really moved very, very quickly to go into cloud solutions to deliver and continue to deliver their business. And as a result, I think a lot of security has not really been factored in. I think people have been focused on keeping the lights on and keeping the business running. And I think security will slowly catch up. And with that, there were security solutions and strategies surrounding how companies handled on-prem security. And now with this more diverse and dispersed network of endpoints, I think people are moving towards a endpoint detection and response solution as opposed to some on-prem solutions.
So boards obviously have to focus on these new risks as part of their oversight responsibilities. And I used to say pre-COVID, which I think COVID now will mark time in many ways, that security risk has changed. And of course, boards have evolved in order to address those changes. Boards are evolving even faster now as a result of the additional risk as a result of COVID. But Jocelyn, let me move back to you. And if you can address some of the ways that boards have evolved, either from a committee perspective or governance perspective.
I would say a couple of things. I think that you see certainly there is a movement towards making sure that you have a board member who has the technical expertise to understand the cybersecurity landscape. And then in addition to that, I think you also see from a governance perspective, maybe different cadences around how you are getting updates. You can also see different committee structures to make sure that the risk is mapped in certain ways. There have been a number of developments and different boards address it different ways, but I think those are a couple of the things. Luke, what have you seen?
Yeah, we've seen a real focus on changing the culture where it's necessary to one of raising risks proactively. It's really a big part of it, to the extent you're a board member and you're wondering if you're hearing the full story, if all you're getting in cyber is good news, unicorns and rainbows, you're not getting the full story. All of our clients, even the most sophisticated ones, have challenges in this area. Vendor risks, for example. No one is really terribly good at that. And so for board members to know if they're getting the full story, having expertise, as you say, Jocelyn, on the board is key. At least some expertise to be able to credibly challenge the people reporting to you, but also having a governance structure where there's healthy reporting lines. If your reporting line goes up through production, through the revenue generating portions of the business, that can be viewed as a yellow flag at a minimum for regulators and others, because can be a tendency to suppress the flow of raising problems and risks. So we're seeing a lot of focus not only on the expertise on the board, but making sure the right flow of information gets to the board.
So we talked about ensuring expertise on the board. So we're seeing a big uptick in what some folks refer to as digital directors, those that have that experience and background, and then also changes in committees. So there oftentimes is a technology committee. Some organizations even have a cybersecurity committee now, depending on the risk. Jason, what are ways in which we can do a better job of educating our boards, assuming that while there may be a digital director, there likely would still be directors who may not be as familiar with cybersecurity risk because they may not have the technology backgrounds or be as familiar with it. So what would you recommend?
So I have seen even a lot of digital directors and some directors who are technically adept and some who may not be. And what I like to do when I'm working with a client is to bring these folks into the decision-making process and put it into terms of risk, right? That's really what this all is. And so when you translate cybersecurity into terms of risk, I think it makes a big difference, because I think it allows for a common language between what may be some highly technical terms to the language of what I think a board member is used to dealing with in their normal day-to-day operations. And what do I mean by that? Essentially, companies are developing risk appetite statements or risk tolerance statements, and that really translates into what I consider to be sort of three major buckets, right? It's helping a company set a narrative about who they are and what kind of security is important to them. And then they root that in like a recognized information security framework, such as NIST or ISO, or it could be anyone. And then finally, I think what's the most important piece of this is really demonstrating some operational maturity. And I think when you put it into those sort of high level buckets, any director, digital director, non-digital director can start to understand what their role is and how they should interface with the company.
So Jason, a question came in that I think relates to what you were talking about, and that is, given the current COVID environment, what should the risk committee focus on when it comes to cyber? And that's assuming that the risk committee is the committee responsible for the cybersecurity oversight. It could also be the committee. You mentioned a little bit about how that risk has changed. Do you have other thoughts in terms of what the focus should be, and also from an education perspective?
Sure. I think these days there's two main areas that I think a board or any C-suite can focus on. The first one would be what Luke touched upon, which is really vendor management or vendor due diligence. I would take a good hard look at who and what companies the IT department and information security department are using now to deliver a work from home solution. I would ask those kind of questions and see what is approved and what is not approved. What I would be most concerned about as a board director is what we call shadow IT, which are you send people to work from home, you give them certain approved applications. They may or may not work that well, and then people will find workarounds to support that. And then those workarounds are what carry an enormous amount of risk for a particular company. So I would say that. And then the second piece would be managing an endpoint detection and response solution, because everybody has gone out now with their laptops. They're all connecting in to networks. And I think the endpoints have become vulnerable. And if you don't have certain security software on there that's appropriate, then you will.
I have a fan there, Jason, joining the program.
I would just say that this is what happens when you work from home. So it is what it is. So I would say that those two, as a board member right now, I would be looking at your endpoint detection and response solutions, and also your third-party vendor management. And by the way, this is Artemis.
Luke, let me turn to you really for two questions, and we can keep Artemis as a participant in our panel. It's important, even more so in light of COVID, that boards are prepared for an incident. And certainly cyber risk has gone up as a result of some of the issues that Jason just described. So how familiar should the board be with the organization's incident response plan, and how do you ensure that they're familiar with it?
Absolutely. It's a very hot issue, because in the past it's been something the board just had reported to them. They weren't so involved directly in operational plans. And it's not that the board should take over the operation of running the response. I think we're going to talk in a little bit about what the board's role should be. But they need to understand the incident response plan for several reasons. One is their duty of oversight includes understanding that the company's got it. They have a plan, that it makes sense, it's logical, that they thought through the issues and the risks. The board's job is to ask questions about that. And then there's another practical effect, which is, what should the board expect? What does the plan say the board should get by way of briefings? When should they be consulted? Will regulators be told about something before the board? Will, God forbid, the company put out a public statement about a non-public breach before that time? without the board knowing. Will they read about it in the Wall Street Journal? And then there's just a practical issue, which is, when senior people who are used to running things at their own companies, when they don't know the plan, they tend to feel like they need to step in. And that can be the worst thing, even though they're very talented and skilled. If everyone's not rowing in the same direction with the same cadence, it ends up being a mess. And so we're increasingly doing board tabletops, I think we'll speak about later, where a lot of the goal is not only what is your role as a board, but what do we not want you to do? And we want you to know that the company is going to take these actions, they have it under control.
So let me segue to Jocelyn for a moment, because a question came in that ties into this part of the conversation, which is, with regard to media pressures, when is the appropriate time to issue a statement to the media? And are you a proponent of getting out ahead of the narrative or waiting until the board has a full grasp of the incident? So that we could spend this whole session talking about this, but certainly speed and transparency tends to be the expectation of the public and regulators, and we have to balance those issues. So Jocelyn, thoughts on managing through those types of issues and making sure the board is in tune?
Yeah, I would say, it's difficult to come up with a one size fits all, because as we all know who've dealt with incidents, the character is a little different, and sometimes one answer may not work for a different situation. But I do think you want to lean heavily towards transparency and getting out ahead of the story. But at the same time, as Luke mentioned, you really want to make sure that you are keeping your board abreast of information that is important for them to know, so that they can function in the way that they are supposed to. They need to provide oversight, and to do that, they need information. And so you have to balance those two out. But I do think you want to make sure that when you're dealing with certainly a large incident, that you are tilting towards being very transparent and getting out in front of a story, while making sure that you keep your board informed.
Right. And trying to be as accurate as possible, so you don't have to walk back those statements.
Exactly. You've got to, one of the things I would advise is you really need to have, some level of a straw man statement out there that you can actually adapt to the situation, so that when you find yourself there, you're not trying to scramble to come up with the words. You already have something that you can begin to work with, because in the heat of the moment, there is a lot of pressure from a lot of different places, and you want to have as much done as you possibly can have done, so that you can move more fluidly through the situation.
Great. And part of that is being prepared, as Luke mentioned. He's seeing more tabletops at the board level. I am too. In fact, I'm seeing that a couple of ways boards are getting involved. One is that some members are observing tabletops that are done at the management level, which has its advantages and disadvantages, because you want to make sure that folks feel comfortable and can make mistakes during the tabletop. That's the time to do it. Also, board members are doing their own tabletops to ensure that they're familiar with that incident response plan. And then they're receiving reports about how management did. Jason, what are you seeing in terms of board exercises?
Yeah, I'm seeing something very, very similar. I think that boards are starting to create or participate in forming what I would say is that defensible information security strategy, right? And I think the piece that they're most involved in is really helping to what I call set the narrative, which is, to Jocelyn's point, it's creating that statement up front about it's an aspirational statement about what we would want to say in the event that something happened. And it would go something like this. We as a company took a risk-based, threat-based approach, and we understand the data and other aspects of our company which carry risk. And as a result of that, we've implemented certain security that would be reasonable and appropriate for the kind of company we are and the kind of budget that we have. And if an attacker did get in, and they would have had to use extraordinary methods to bypass our reasonable security. So it would go something like that. And we start with that high level topic, and then we start to drill down to what does that actually mean, and how can you apply that to the company, and what constituencies in the company would need to be involved to help execute on, to make that narrative work in the event something happened, right? So it's a little artificial, but I think that's the aspiration.
Yep. And actually, I think the expectation of many regulators today is that boards will become familiar and participate in those exercises. One benefit that I have seen is aligning the reporting expectations of the board and management. And in the exercise with management, one of the issues would be, well, when do you report to the board? In the exercise with the board is, when do you expect management to report to the board? So it helps to align those expectations. Luke, how else can you help management and board align reporting expectations?
Well, a huge area that's been, part of the recent news in this space is in terms of securities issues, securities trading issues. How will material issues be raised up? What policies and procedures should we have in advance, as required by the SEC and others, to ensure that information flow gets to decision makers who might need to, for example, close a trading window or make a change in risk disclosures the next time they come around. This is just one example. More broadly than that, I think it's plugging the board into the ongoing cyber program, not just when there's an incident, but that they understand the main information assets of the company. They understand the key choices around those assets, including vendors, use of cloud, to Jason's point. They should, and they must really participate in some of the major risk judgments from an oversight perspective. And so I think the less of that's novel to them before an incident arises, the more that they're part of the fabric of those choices and decisions, the easier it is to ensure that in an incident they have the right information flow, the reporting lines are there, and they can discharge regulatory obligations.
Yeah. So a couple of questions I'm going to pass on to Jocelyn and Jason. One has to do with audits and information that's reported back to the board and what you're seeing in that regard, and also escalation policies. I'm seeing more policies being developed that then actually puts into writing some expectations of when management should report cybersecurity incidents to a board. Obviously, it can't be all fleshed out in detail because every incident is different and management has to use their business judgment. But Jocelyn, what are you seeing both in terms of from an auditing perspective as well as from an escalation policy perspective?
The area of audits clearly is one that has got a lot of energy around it. And certainly I think most companies are doing it and should do it. And I agree with Luke that really what you want to do is you want to make sure that your board is not getting information, at the time of the incident. So as you are conducting audits and coming up with findings, I think it's important that that information be shared on some regular cadence with the board. Now, how that's done is going to vary by company, but certainly it's something that I think boards have an expectation around getting that type of information because it is important information. And then I think with respect to the second question, which was related to, remind me?
Escalation policies.
Escalation policies. I think that has to be a part of your planning. I think, when you're thinking of incident response plan, you need to have a plan that sort of scopes out like what the different levels of risk are and what the cutoffs are and what happens for those cutoffs. There are things that are small enough that maybe the C-suite does not need to know about, but it may be something that can be worked on, with a group below that. There are incidents that are large enough that you need to make sure that the C-suite knows about immediately. Those types of situations are probably also the situations where you want to make sure that your board has some information about it. Now, the timing of that might vary by the type of incident that it is, but ultimately, when you're reporting to a board, you want to make sure that they have a sense of incidents that are truly large risk at the time that they happen. But as you're doing a reporting cadence, you want to make sure that they have a sense of the type of incidents that are occurring on a regular basis. And as I think somebody said on the panel, you don't want to report every incident that you might have. But on the other hand, you want to make sure that they have a good sense of the types of incidents that a company is dealing with.
Yeah, that's a great way to put it.
Yeah.
Great way to put it. And of course, boards never like to read in the newspaper about some incident that pops up, even if it's not a big one.
Yeah.
If it's going to be publicly reported, it's a good thing to let you know.
Absolutely. I would advise against that in every instance.
Jason, thoughts that you have on maybe even cadence of reporting to the board as well as escalation?
Sure. I completely agree with Jocelyn. And I think one of the things that we try to do with our clients is to really give a framework or a logic tree to help employees who are triaging incidents, right? The lower level employees who are initially assessing these incidents and trying to help them figure out when does this decision, what is important and what's not important. And so what I do is we break it down into 5 buckets and help them assess like the event classification, the impact that this potentially could have, like say number of systems affected, system criticality. Did it hit servers? Did it hit an endpoint? What kind of data was affected? Was it regulated data like PCI data, HIPAA data, things like that? And then we create a nice matrix and we make it easy. You score up all the numbers, and if it goes over a certain threshold, you call your boss, and then your boss's boss, and then your boss's boss's boss until you make it up to the top, right? And I think that helps to avoid certain things that could look maybe not important to a line employee, but really could have quite serious implications to the company from slipping and maybe not getting reported in a timely manner. So that's how we tend to handle it.
Thanks. Let's move to reporting when you're in the middle of an incident and the types of reports that boards would expect. I mean, we have reports on legal obligations, forensic updates, media and communication strategies, law enforcement. Luke, from your perspective, how much of this should be coming into the board kind of on a real-time basis?
Yeah, it's a very good question. We've seen the good, bad, and ugly of this. The ugly is where it's either there's a gap in information, there's a shortage of information. The other end of the spectrum is there's a flood, and there's no ability for the board really to sort what they need to decide out from the flow of information. So, if you're doing incident response planning right in my book, you've got, a core team approach, and you're identifying the core issues cross-functionally. The strategic issues are getting briefed up to the board, and those will vary a little bit from company to company, but they tend to be, when are we coming out with a public statement, and what's the overall theme of that? What type of customer accommodations are we going to offer that, are hundreds of millions of dollars at issue? These are the big picture strategic questions in an incident. It may be about suspending securities trading, where you want the board to weigh in on an issue like that. So the board is going to get an early touch. Often it's a phone call to the board chair, and there's a streamlined way of putting the board on notice that something's happening. And then there's a regular cadence that starts out more rapidly in the early stages of the incident and then tapers over time as we start to get control of things. It's typically the chief information security officer and the general counsel, or some combination of technical and legal, that we see briefing the issues. Communications issues are a huge part of it. It can't just be the technical briefing. It has to also anticipate issues like when we might come out and say something publicly, how are we positioned if we're approached or something leaks. Those types of issues are front and center for boards.
Yeah, and that obviously means that the board is weighing not only legal risk, they're also weighing reputational risk. Obviously, risk it covers all of these issues. Let's talk a little bit about privilege around communications to the board, both when you are communicating to the board about cybersecurity risk, because obviously if we're doing third-party audits, which is more and more popular, we're seeing internal audits, but we're also seeing a lot of different types of third-party assessments and frameworks that boards are considering the cybersecurity risk. What are your thoughts, Jocelyn, around how much of that should be underprivileged when you're talking about the organization's current vulnerabilities, as well as when you're reporting in, for example, on a forensic investigation that has identified some weakness that may have led to a security incident?
Well, I think, again, I'm not sure there's a one-size-fits-all, but I do think that it's an issue that you need to grapple with, because at the time that you are experiencing an incident, you're also facing into a host of other issues that you will confront that are of a legal nature. And so you need to think through the privilege and, how you're going to need to use that as you defend the company, and then let that inform, what it is that you want to do. But I would say that you have to really think through it, because the privilege is definitely something that can be very useful, but sometimes something that you may want to be privileged is also something that you would use as a sword. And so maybe it's not something that you might immediately believe that you would privilege it, but later on it may be something that you actually need. So I don't know that I have any, cast in stone advice about that, but it is something that you have to carefully traverse.
Well, and I think that's the point, right? You need to think about it on the front end, because it may be that you think about a third-party risk assessment. The purpose may be to identify issues that you need to address. There may also be the purpose that you'd like to share it.
Yeah.
So you may want to share it with business partners, with regulators. And so thinking about it on the front end can be an important part of it, even developing a process where you may be able to do certain aspects of it under privilege and some with an eye towards sharing. Luke, you have other thoughts on that?
No, I think that's right. And we would treat a board different than we would treat outside auditors. I mean, the board is generally in the cone of privilege. Mm-hmm. We do try to limit the downstream damage if privilege is overcome. For example, a reason not to share a full forensic report with the board might be books and records request considerations. There's the Garner factors in Delaware that can overcome privilege. And so it's not without risk. So we try to make sure the board has all the information they need. They're in the cone of privilege to start with, but think about being judicious in terms of how much we put in writing into the board record. I think there's an art to that. Outside auditors, insurers, and other outside parties are not in the cone. And so you're in a waiver situation. You need to stay factual. It shouldn't come through the mouth of your outside counsel running the investigation or your forensic team. Certainly your press statement should not refer to how your forensic team has, outside forensic team has given you a clean bill of health. That's a waiver now in at least 3 or 4 circuits. It needs to stay factual.
Yeah. So here's a question, because I think obviously board members think about this. What is their own exposure here when you're talking about a cyber incident? And not just for public boards, but of course nonprofits have boards too. Should the nonprofit folks be thinking about the same issues? Jocelyn and Luke, what are your thoughts on that?
Not sure I'm an expert on nonprofit boards, but I would say, yes, they need to be thinking about the same issues, because I think that there is exposure, at least on the public side, for sure. And I would assume that same exposure runs to non-public boards as well.
Yeah, the liability risks are changing now in light of the Equifax and Yahoo derivative settlements. $149 million for Equifax a couple of months ago to settle that, $29 million in the Yahoo case a year ago, and a couple of recent decisions in the Delaware courts suggesting the business judgment rule, certainly reminding everyone that good faith engagement with the issues is required before you even have the protections. And that's a challenge in cyber. If you don't know what you don't know, you may be at risk of losing those protections. So all the more reason to engage early.
Yeah, absolutely. I mean, the risks are there, right? They're, and that's something from an insurance perspective to think about as well. And that becomes important for the organization from a cybersecurity insurance perspective and from a D&O perspective. There's another question that came in on what should be communicated to a committee versus the full board. Jason, do you have thoughts, particularly in the context of a security incident? Are you finding that you are reporting in as a third-party forensic investigator to a committee or to the full board?
So what I've seen, well, just to say, to add on to what Jocelyn and Luke said, we are always, and Phyllis, you know this, engaged through through a law firm to protect privilege. And I think when we're wind up doing our reporting tends to be to the C-suite and occasionally an audit committee member or a cyber or digital director. It's rarely to the full board until after the incident has been declared over and resolved. And then I think what boards ask us to come in and do is not only give an update on the investigation, but to also provide observations about more strategic shortcomings that led to this event, like what went wrong from a technology standpoint, from a budgeting standpoint, from an operational standpoint, things like that, so that a strategic remediation could be developed and to get the board support for funding and also management commitment to support this.
So we're getting close to the end of our session, and I thought I would just go around and ask everyone to give some thoughts and takeaways, both from a sort of incident response lessons learned, and each of you have been very involved in dealing with issues both at the company level and at the board level. And then if there are any particular takeaways for board members to think about to help them become more prepared for an inevitable security incident. Jocelyn, let's start with you.
Well, I think my pointer would be one that is blindingly obvious, but you need to have an incident response plan. You don't need to let it sit and gather dust. You have to continue to look at it and make sure that it addresses the issues as they continue to develop and crystallize. And then with respect to a board, I would just say be respectful of the fact that they actually have a duty to perform and make sure they have the information that they need to perform that duty.
Luke, what are your thoughts?
Well, I often get asked about just the tail end. Like the most popular question is, do we pay a ransom? When I brief a board, they want to know about ransomware. And I think it's a healthy way in the door to ask, what's the whole chain of events that culminates in your systems being encrypted? What are your backups? What's the segmentation? What are the endpoint protections, like Jason said? The attackers prepare the battlefield and then they launch the attack. And I would turn that around as a tip for the board and say, how can we prepare the battlefield? What are our backups? How can we remove the requirement to pay and still be prepared to pay if we had to? How can we segment the network? How would we shut off different types of connections and make risk-based choices to limit it? And we can't make it be Fort Knox or a black box, but we can make important choices up front.
Thanks. Jason?
Sure. And I know I completely agree with Luke and Jocelyn. I would say that if I was to leave a board member with something in this day and age of COVID and work from home scenarios, I would say that I would really take a good look at your vendor management program. Who's delivering your vendor management? Who's delivering your IT, if it's a cloud or third party? I would also check and ensure that you have good cyber insurance and cyber insurance coverage, that the company is covered in some way. And then finally, I would say that, I would get involved. Like if I was a board member and IT is not my thing, I would still try to get involved, because I think that a management commitment all the way from the board level coming down demonstrates that this is important, and then it becomes more important for the company in and of itself.
Yeah, Agree with you all, and I would just add that those tabletop exercises do make a big difference. They don't have to be a full day commitment. They can be a couple of hours. And I would also say that boards should pay attention to what regulators have required of other boards after a security incident, because it provides a great roadmap of what their expectations will be if that organization is under scrutiny. So thank you all, and thank you for the special appearances of Artemis. He added
Yes.
sparkle to our panel. Appreciate it. Bruce, back to you.
Thanks. Terrific job. Thank you, Phyllis, and a great job by all of you. The next panel begins at 10:10. It's on business email compromise attacks. We will see you all in a few minutes. Thank you.